When 71-year-old Richard Hampton's long-lost twin brother Robert appeared at their parents' funeral after decades apart, Charleston's high society saw it as a touching family reunion. But behind the warm smiles, Robert had spent months memorizing Richard's habits, forging his signature, and perfecting his voice, preparing to become his brother and claim the $7.3 million inheritance that wasn't his to take. This is the story of how identical genetics became the perfect crime weapon, and how a successful attorney's life was stolen by the person who looked exactly like him. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. You'll want to hear every detail of this twin identity theft story. Richard Hampton had built his life methodically and successfully. At 71, he was one of Charleston's most respected attorneys, having run Hampton & Associates for 45 years before selling the practice in 2020 for $4.2 million. Combined with his investments, real estate, and family wealth, Richard's net worth had reached $7.3 million. Richard's success wasn't just financial. He was deeply connected to Charleston's elite social circles, serving on the boards of 3 charitable organizations, maintaining membership at the exclusive Magnolia Country Club, and hosting monthly dinner parties at his historic downtown mansion. Richard's social calendar was predictable and well-established. Tuesday mornings at the country club for tennis, Wednesday afternoons volunteering at the Charleston Museum, Friday evenings at the Opera or Symphony, Sunday brunch at his favorite restaurant on King Street. His routines were known throughout Charleston's high society. Robert Hampton, Richard's identical twin brother, had taken a completely different path in life. Where Richard had built wealth and reputation through disciplined work, Robert had squandered every opportunity through poor decisions and reckless behavior. Robert had left Charleston in 1995 after a series of failed business ventures and mounting debts. He'd spent the intervening decades drifting between cities, trying various schemes to make money quickly, and avoiding creditors who were still pursuing him for loans that had gone bad in the 1990s. By 2023, Robert was essentially homeless, living in his car and working occasional day labor jobs in Atlanta. He owed over $200,000 to various creditors, and had exhausted all legitimate ways to earn money. Robert had always resented Richard's success, believing that his brother had simply been luckier rather than more disciplined. The fact that they were identical twins made the disparity in their fortunes particularly galling to Robert. "We have the same DNA, the same opportunities," Robert would tell anyone who would listen. "The only difference is that Richard got the breaks and I didn't." But Robert's luck was about to change, though not in any way that Richard could have anticipated. In November 2023, their parents, Charles and Margaret Hampton, both died within 2 weeks of each other. Charles suffered a heart attack at age 95, and Margaret died of pneumonia shortly after. The Hampton family patriarch and matriarch were gone, leaving behind an estate worth approximately $4 million. Richard, as the successful and reliable son, had been named executor of their parents' estate and primary beneficiary of their will. Robert was mentioned in the will but would receive only $100,000, a sum their parents had considered appropriate given his history of financial irresponsibility. When Richard called Robert to inform him of their parents' deaths, Robert saw an opportunity that would solve all his financial problems permanently. Robert realized that he could potentially steal not just the inheritance but Richard's entire identity and fortune. Robert's plan began forming during the phone call when Richard informed him of their parents' deaths. Richard, being gracious and family-oriented, invited Robert to stay at the family home during the funeral arrangements and estate settlement process. "Bob, I know we haven't been close, but family should be together during times like this," Richard said. "You can stay in your old room for as long as you need." Robert accepted the invitation, but not for the reasons Richard assumed. Robert saw this as an opportunity to study his brother's life in detail, learning everything he would need to know to successfully impersonate Richard. The funeral was scheduled for December 15th, giving Robert 3 weeks to observe Richard's routines, social connections, and personal habits. During those 3 weeks, Robert conducted what amounted to an intensive surveillance operation on his own twin brother. He accompanied Richard to social events, listening carefully to conversations about Richard's business relationships, charitable activities, and personal history. Robert studied Richard's handwriting, practicing signature forgery during the hours when Richard was out of the house. He recorded Richard's phone conversations, noting speech patterns, vocabulary choices, and the way Richard interacted with different people. Most importantly, Robert began mapping Richard's social network, identifying the key people whose recognition and acceptance would be necessary for a successful identity theft. Margaret Worthington, Richard's neighbor and close friend, who knew details about Richard's daily routines and personal preferences. Dr. James Morrison, Richard's physician for 20 years, who would have intimate knowledge of Richard's medical history and health status. Thomas Chen, Richard's financial advisor who managed Richard's investment portfolio and would be crucial for accessing Richard's wealth. Patricia Williams, Richard's housekeeper, who cleaned his house twice a week and knew his private habits better than almost anyone. Robert realized that fooling these people would require more than just physical resemblance. He would need to convincingly replicate Richard's personality, knowledge, and relationships. Robert also discovered that Richard had recently begun dating Elizabeth Martinez, a widow he'd met at a charity function. Their relationship was still relatively new, which Robert saw as an advantage. Elizabeth wouldn't have decades of intimate knowledge about Richard's personal history. During the 3 weeks before the funeral, Robert also learned about Richard's financial arrangements. Richard's wealth was held in multiple accounts across several institutions, with varying levels of security and oversight. Some accounts required only signature verification for access. Others required personal appearance and photo identification. A few required multiple forms of authentication, including personal questions about Richard's history. Robert began developing strategies for accessing each type of account, realizing that his identical appearance would overcome most security measures, while his growing knowledge of Richard's personal history would handle the rest. The funeral itself provided Robert with the perfect opportunity to observe how Charleston's elite interacted with Richard, what they expected from him, and how he could blend into their social circles without suspicion. Charles and Margaret Hampton's funeral was a major social event in Charleston, attended by over 300 people, including judges, politicians, business leaders, and members of the city's oldest families. Robert used the funeral as a live training exercise, staying close to Richard and observing how his brother interacted with different groups of people. "Richard, I'm so sorry for your loss," said Judge Patricia Rodriguez, embracing Richard warmly. "Your parents were pillars of this community." "Thank you, Patricia," Richard replied. "They lived full lives and contributed so much to Charleston. I hope to continue their legacy of service." Robert memorized these types of exchanges, noting Richard's formal but warm speaking style, his tendency to focus conversations on other people rather than himself, and his deep knowledge of Charleston's social and political networks. During the reception following the funeral, Robert positioned himself strategically to overhear conversations about Richard's business dealings, social commitments, and personal relationships. "Richard, are you still planning to chair the museum fundraiser in February?" asked Margaret Worthington. "Absolutely," Richard replied. "It's one of my favorite events each year." Robert made mental notes about Richard's upcoming commitments, realizing he would need to either fulfill these obligations or find believable excuses to avoid them. Robert also observed how people reacted to seeing the identical twins together. Many guests commented on their remarkable similarity, but they also noted subtle differences in posture, clothing style, and social confidence that distinguished Richard from Robert. "It's amazing how identical you two are," said Dr. Morrison. "But I can always tell you apart, Richard. You carry yourself differently than your brother." This observation troubled Robert. If people could distinguish between them when they were side by side, his impersonation would need to be perfect to avoid detection when he was alone. After the funeral, Robert had accomplished several important objectives. He had identified the key people in Richard's social circle who would need to be convinced of his identity. He had learned about Richard's speaking patterns, social style, and personal relationships. He had gathered information about Richard's financial accounts and business arrangements. Most importantly, he had confirmed that people could distinguish between the twins when they were together, which meant his plan would require Richard's complete absence from Charleston. Robert's plan was evolving from simple inheritance theft to complete identity replacement. Robert's strategy for replacing Richard was methodical and patient. Rather than attempting a sudden switch, Robert planned a gradual transition that would allow him to assume Richard's identity piece by piece without triggering suspicion. Phase 1 involved extending his stay in Charleston beyond the funeral and estate settlement. Robert claimed he was enjoying reconnecting with his brother and wanted to spend more time in their childhood home. "Rich, would it be okay if I stayed a few more weeks?" Robert asked. "It's been so long since we've been close, and I'd like to get to know you again." Richard, who valued family relationships and felt guilty about their decades of separation, readily agreed. During the extended stay, Robert began what he privately called identity training. He convinced Richard to take him along to various social and business activities, claiming he wanted to understand Richard's life better. Robert accompanied Richard to his Tuesday tennis games at the country club, where he observed Richard's playing style, his relationships with other members, and the casual conversations that revealed details about Richard's personal history. "Richard, how's your backhand been since the shoulder surgery?" asked tennis partner James Wilson. Robert learned that Richard had undergone shoulder surgery 3 years ago and still occasionally experienced stiffness during cold weather. Robert joined Richard for Wednesday volunteer activities at the Charleston Museum, where he met the staff members who knew Richard well and learned about his expertise in local history and antique collections. "Mr. Hampton, we're so grateful for your knowledge of 18th century furniture," said Museum Director Sarah Martinez. "Your presentations are always the most popular with visitors." Robert realized he would need to quickly develop expertise in Charleston history and antique furniture to maintain Richard's reputation as a knowledgeable volunteer. Most importantly, Robert accompanied Richard to Friday's social events, where he met Elizabeth Martinez and began studying their romantic relationship. "Bob, it's wonderful to finally meet Richard's brother," Elizabeth said. "He's told me so much about your family history." Robert was charming and attentive to Elizabeth, but he was also gathering intelligence about her relationship with Richard. How long had they been dating? What did they talk about? What were Richard's romantic habits and preferences? During these activities, Robert also began subtly undermining Richard's social standing while building his own credibility. When Richard made small mistakes or forgot minor details, Robert would gently correct him, creating the impression that Robert had a better memory or more accurate knowledge. "Actually, Rich, I think the museum board meeting is next Tuesday, not Wednesday," Robert would say in front of other people. These minor corrections made Richard appear slightly confused or forgetful while positioning Robert as the more reliable twin. Robert also began establishing independent relationships with Richard's social circle, engaging in conversations that didn't involve Richard, and demonstrating his own charm and intelligence. "Bob, you have such interesting perspectives on Charleston's development," Margaret Worthington told him. "You and Richard think so similarly, but you express things differently." After 6 weeks of intensive observation and relationship building, Robert felt ready for Phase 2 of his plan, convincing Richard to take an extended trip that would remove him from Charleston temporarily. Robert's plan required Richard to be absent from Charleston for several weeks while Robert established himself as the real Richard Hampton in the community. But convincing Richard to leave town required careful manipulation. Robert began planting seeds about Richard's need for rest and recovery after the stress of their parents' deaths and estate settlement. "Rich, you've been working so hard on the estate paperwork," Robert said. "Maybe you should take a vacation, get away from Charleston for a while, and clear your head." Richard initially resisted the idea. His social and charitable commitments in Charleston were important to him, and he didn't want to abandon his responsibilities. But Robert was persistent and strategic in his persuasion. Robert researched locations that would appeal to Richard's interests and found a month-long cultural tour of Italy that focused on Renaissance art and architecture. Richard had always been interested in European art history, and the tour seemed designed for someone with his educational background and interests. "Look at this tour, Rich," Robert said, showing Richard the brochure. "It covers every major Renaissance city in Italy, with private museum access and expert guides. It's exactly the kind of thing you'd love." Richard was intrigued but still hesitant about leaving Charleston for an entire month. Robert's breakthrough came when he suggested that the trip would help Richard process their parents' deaths and prepare emotionally for the next phase of his life. "You've spent your whole adult life building success and taking care of responsibilities," Robert said. "Mom and Dad are gone now. Maybe it's time to focus on your own happiness and personal interests." Richard found this argument compelling. At 71, he had accomplished everything he'd wanted professionally and financially. Perhaps it was time for a period of personal enrichment and reflection. Richard booked the Italy tour for February 2024, giving Robert 6 weeks to prepare for his complete identity replacement. During the weeks before Richard's departure, Robert intensified his study of Richard's personal history, financial arrangements, and social relationships. Robert practiced Richard's signature until he could replicate it perfectly under any circumstances. He studied Richard's medical records, which he accessed during a visit to Dr. Morrison's office while accompanying Richard for a routine checkup. Robert memorized details about Richard's business history, his charitable activities, and his family background that would be necessary for convincing long-term friends and associates. Most importantly, Robert began laying the groundwork for explanations about any personality or behavioral changes that people might notice after his identity switch. "I'm thinking about making some changes when I get back from Italy," Robert said during conversations with Richard's friends. "This trip might give me new perspectives on how I want to spend the rest of my life." This planted the expectation that Richard might be somewhat different after his European adventure, providing cover for Robert's imperfect impersonation. The night before Richard's departure for Italy, Robert made his final preparations for the most audacious identity theft in Charleston's history. February 12, 2024, was the day Robert Hampton ceased to exist, and Richard Hampton began living two lives, one in Italy as himself and one in Charleston as his twin brother. Richard's flight to Rome departed at 6 a.m. from Charleston International Airport. Robert drove him to the airport, maintaining the appearance of a caring brother who would miss Richard's company. "Take care of yourself, Bob," Richard said as they embraced at the departure gate. "I'm glad we reconnected after all these years." "Safe travels, Rich," Robert replied. "I'll take care of everything here while you're gone." Richard had no idea how literally Robert intended that promise. After Richard's plane departed, Robert drove to Richard's house, which was now his house, and began the systematic process of becoming Richard Hampton. Robert's first challenge was Richard's housekeeper, Patricia Williams, who was scheduled to clean the house that afternoon. Patricia had worked for Richard for 8 years and knew his habits intimately. When Patricia arrived, Robert greeted her as Richard, explaining that he had decided not to go to Italy after all. "Mr. Hampton, I thought you were leaving for Europe this morning," Patricia said, looking confused. "I changed my mind at the last minute," Robert replied, using Richard's speech patterns and tone. "The thought of being away from Charleston for a month seemed overwhelming after everything that's happened with my parents." Patricia accepted this explanation, though she seemed slightly puzzled by subtle differences in Richard's behavior and demeanor. Robert's second test came that evening, when Elizabeth Martinez called to wish Richard a safe trip to Italy. "Richard, how was your flight to Rome?" Elizabeth asked. "Actually, I decided not to go," Robert replied. "I realized I wasn't ready to be so far from home right now." "Oh, that's disappointing," Elizabeth said. "You were so excited about seeing the Renaissance art collections." Robert realized he needed to be more careful about maintaining consistency in his explanations for canceling the trip. Over the following days, Robert gradually introduced himself to Richard's world as the real Richard Hampton. He attended Richard's Tuesday tennis game at the country club, explaining to his playing partners that he had decided against the Italy trip. "Richard, you seem different today," observed tennis partner James Wilson, "more relaxed somehow." "I've been doing some thinking about what I want from life," Robert replied, using the personality change narrative he had prepared. "Maybe it's time to be less rigid in my routines." Robert volunteered at the Charleston Museum on Wednesday, where he struggled slightly with questions about specific historical artifacts, but managed to deflect most inquiries by claiming he was still processing the emotional impact of his parents' deaths. The most challenging test came during his Friday evening date with Elizabeth Martinez. Robert had observed Richard's interactions with Elizabeth, but romantic intimacy required a different level of impersonation. "Richard, you're being very mysterious tonight," Elizabeth said during dinner. "You seem like a different person." "I've been reflecting on what I want from my relationships," Robert replied. "Maybe I've been too reserved in the past." Elizabeth found this explanation intriguing rather than suspicious, and Robert realized that people were willing to accept significant personality changes if they were framed as positive personal growth. After 2 weeks of successful impersonation, Robert felt confident enough to begin accessing Richard's financial accounts. Robert's approach to accessing Richard's wealth was careful and systematic. He started with the accounts that required only signature verification, gradually working toward the more secure arrangements that required additional authentication. Richard's checking account at First National Bank of Charleston was Robert's initial target. The account contained approximately $180,000 and required only a signature for withdrawals under $50,000. Robert visited the bank on a Tuesday morning, dressed in Richard's typical style and carrying identification that he had obtained from Richard's house. "Good morning, Mr. Hampton," said teller Jennifer Martinez. "How can I help you today?" "I'd like to make a withdrawal," Robert replied, using Richard's calm, professional demeanor. "Of course. How much would you like to withdraw?" $45,000. The teller processed the withdrawal without question, recognizing Richard and accepting his signature as authentic. Robert repeated this process at 3 other banks over the following week, withdrawing a total of $320,000 from Richard's various checking and savings accounts. But Robert's real target was Richard's investment portfolio, managed by financial advisor Thomas Chen, and worth approximately $4.8 million. Robert scheduled an appointment with Thomas, claiming he wanted to discuss rebalancing his investment strategy. "Richard, it's good to see you," Thomas said when Robert arrived at his office. "How was your trip to Italy?" "I decided not to go," Robert replied. "I realized I needed to focus on financial planning instead of travel." Thomas accepted this explanation and began discussing Richard's investment portfolio in detail. "Your portfolio has performed exceptionally well this year," Thomas explained. "You're up nearly 12% across all holdings." Robert listened carefully, learning about Richard's investment preferences and asking questions that would help him understand how to access the funds. "Thomas, I've been thinking about liquidating some positions," Robert said, "perhaps 30% of the total portfolio." "That's a significant change, Richard. Can I ask, what's motivating this decision?" Robert had prepared for this question. "I'm considering some major life changes. Travel, philanthropy, maybe purchasing property in Europe." Thomas was surprised by the deviation from Richard's typically conservative financial approach, but he didn't question Richard's right to make investment decisions. "It will take a few days to execute those transactions," Thomas said. "I'll prepare the paperwork for your signature." Robert signed the documents in Richard's handwriting, authorizing the liquidation of $1.4 million in investments. But Robert's most audacious financial move involved the inheritance from their parents' estate. As executor of the estate, Richard had the authority to distribute assets according to their parents' will. The will specified that Richard would receive $3.9 million, while Robert would receive $100,000. Robert, now impersonating Richard, decided to revise the estate distribution to reflect what he claimed were their parents' final wishes. Robert forged a codicil to the will, claiming that Charles and Margaret Hampton had expressed privately to Richard their desire to distribute the estate equally between both sons. The forged codicil gave Robert Hampton $2 million instead of $100,000, while reducing Richard Hampton's inheritance to $1.9 million. Robert presented this document to the probate court, signing as Richard Hampton in his capacity as estate executor. "My parents spoke to me privately before their deaths," Robert told the probate judge. "They realized they had been unfair to my brother Robert and wanted to correct that imbalance." The judge accepted Robert's testimony and approved the revised estate distribution. Within 3 weeks of Richard's departure for Italy, Robert had successfully stolen over $2.8 million through various forms of financial fraud. But Robert's scheme had a fatal flaw that he had not anticipated. Richard's trip to Italy included regular communication with people in Charleston. Robert's identity theft was proceeding smoothly until Richard began calling Charleston from Italy to check on his affairs and maintain contact with his friends and romantic partner. Richard's first call came on February 20th, 8 days after his supposed departure. He called Elizabeth Martinez from Rome to share his excitement about the art collections he was seeing. "Elizabeth, the Vatican museums are incredible," Richard said during their phone conversation. "I'm so glad I decided to take this trip after all." Elizabeth was confused. "Richard, I thought you decided not to go to Italy. We had dinner last Friday, and you said you had canceled the trip." Richard was puzzled by Elizabeth's statement. "What do you mean? I've been in Italy for over a week. We haven't seen each other since I left for the airport." "That's impossible," Elizabeth replied. "I had dinner with you 3 days ago at Magnolia Restaurant. You seemed different, but it was definitely you." Richard realized that something was seriously wrong. Someone was impersonating him in Charleston while he was in Italy. Richard immediately called his financial advisor, Thomas Chen. "Thomas, this is Richard Hampton calling from Italy. I need to check on my investment accounts immediately." "Richard, we just met 2 days ago," Thomas replied. You authorized the liquidation of $1.4 million in investments. Are you having second thoughts about those transactions? I never authorized any liquidations, Richard said, his voice rising with alarm. I've been in Italy for over a week. Someone has been impersonating me. Thomas was initially skeptical. Richard, this is a very unusual claim. The person I met with had your identification, knew details about your investment history, and signed documents in your handwriting. Thomas, I'm telling you that I've been in Rome for 8 days. Check my passport records. Verify my location through the hotel. Someone is stealing my identity and my money. The urgency in Richard's voice convinced Thomas that the situation required immediate investigation. Richard also called Dr. Morrison, Margaret Worthington, and several other friends, learning that Richard Hampton had been actively participating in Charleston society while the real Richard was thousands of miles away in Italy. The person you've been seeing is my twin brother, Robert, Richard explained to each contact. He's been impersonating me and accessing my financial accounts. Richard's friends were shocked but began to understand the subtle differences they had noticed in Richard's recent behavior. I thought you seemed different, Margaret Worthington told Richard. More aggressive, less thoughtful, but you looked exactly the same. Richard realized that Robert's impersonation had been sophisticated enough to fool people who had known Richard for decades. Richard immediately contacted the Charleston Police Department from Italy, reporting the identity theft and financial fraud. Detective Sarah Rodriguez, Charleston Police Department. Detective, this is Richard Hampton calling from Rome, Italy. My twin brother is impersonating me in Charleston and has stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from my accounts. Detective Rodriguez was initially skeptical about the unusual nature of Richard's claim, but she agreed to investigate when Richard provided detailed information about his location in Italy and the specific financial transactions he had not authorized. Richard cut his Italy trip short and booked an immediate flight back to Charleston, knowing that confronting Robert would require his physical presence to prove his identity. But Robert had been monitoring Richard's communications and realized that his scheme was about to be exposed. Robert had to decide, flee Charleston with the money he had already stolen, or attempt an even more audacious deception to maintain his identity theft. Robert chose deception. When Robert learned that Richard was returning to Charleston and that several people were becoming suspicious about the identity deception, he realized his twin brother's return would expose the entire scheme. Robert's solution was breathtakingly audacious. He would claim that Richard was actually the imposter, and that he, Robert, was the real Richard Hampton. Robert's plan exploited the fundamental weakness in identity verification. When two people are physically identical, proving which one is real becomes a matter of convincing others rather than physical evidence. Robert contacted Detective Rodriguez before Richard's flight arrived in Charleston. Detective, this is Richard Hampton, Robert said. I understand someone has been calling you claiming to be me while supposedly in Italy. Mr. Hampton, this is very confusing, Detective Rodriguez replied. I spoke with someone claiming to be you calling from Rome, saying his twin brother was impersonating him here in Charleston. That person was my brother Robert, Robert explained. He's been having serious mental health problems and has been making delusional claims about being me. The Italy story is completely fabricated. Robert's counter-narrative was clever and psychologically plausible. He positioned the real Richard as a mentally unstable brother making false claims, while presenting himself as the victim of harassment by a delusional sibling. Detective, I can provide documentation of my identity, my financial accounts, and my presence in Charleston over the past month, Robert continued. I think my brother may need psychiatric evaluation. Robert had prepared for this confrontation by gathering evidence that would support his claim to be the real Richard Hampton. Robert had been living in Richard's house, using Richard's identification, and maintaining Richard's social relationships for 3 weeks. From an outside perspective, he had more recent evidence of being Richard Hampton than the real Richard would have. Robert also exploited the fact that the real Richard's Italy trip would be difficult to verify immediately. Richard's hotel records, passport stamps, and travel documentation would take time to authenticate, while Robert could provide immediate evidence of his presence in Charleston. When Richard's flight landed at Charleston International Airport, he was met by police officers who treated him as a potentially delusional person making false identity claims. Sir, we need to verify your identity, Officer James Wilson explained. There are conflicting claims about which person is actually Richard Hampton. Richard was shocked by this treatment. I am Richard Hampton. I live at 1247 Meeting Street. I'm a retired attorney. My parents Charles and Margaret Hampton just died, and my twin brother Robert is impersonating me." "That's exactly what the other person said you would claim," Officer Wilson replied. "We need to sort this out carefully." Richard realized that Robert had anticipated his return and had positioned himself as the real Richard while painting the actual Richard as a mentally unstable imposter. The situation that followed was unprecedented in Charleston's legal history. Two identical men, each claiming to be Richard Hampton, each able to provide evidence supporting their identity claims. Robert had the advantage of immediate access to Richard's house, financial accounts, and social relationships. The real Richard had the advantage of deeper historical knowledge and authentic emotional connections. But proving which twin was real would require more than surface evidence. The Charleston Police Department faced an unprecedented situation. Two physically identical men, both claiming to be Richard Hampton, both with plausible evidence supporting their identity claims. Detective Rodriguez decided that resolving the identity dispute would require comprehensive investigation rather than quick verification. Both men were taken to the police station for extensive questioning and evidence review. Robert, who had been living as Richard for 3 weeks, had immediate access to Richard's identification documents, house keys, and personal belongings. He could recite Richard's social security number, bank account information, and current relationships. Richard, calling from Italy and then arriving at the airport, had to rely on historical knowledge and documentation from his travel records. "This is obviously a mental health crisis," Robert told Detective Rodriguez. "My brother Robert has been delusional about being me for years. The Italy story's a complete fabrication." Robert's strategy was to present himself as the long-suffering victim of a mentally ill brother's identity obsession. Richard's approach was to provide detailed historical information that only the real Richard Hampton would know. "Detective, I can tell you about my law practice, my clients, cases I handled over 45 years, Richard said. "I can provide details about my education, my family history, events that happened decades before this impersonation began." Detective Rodriguez realized that determining the truth would require extensive verification and expert assistance. The police contacted handwriting experts to analyze signature samples from both men. Richard's authentic signatures from decades of legal documents would be compared with Robert's recent forgeries. Dr. James Morrison was asked to examine both men and determine which one matched his medical records for Richard Hampton. 20 years of medical history would provide biological markers that could distinguish between the twins. Thomas Chen, Richard's financial advisor, was interviewed about the recent investment liquidations and asked to identify which person had actually authorized those transactions. Most importantly, investigators began verifying Richard's Italy travel records through passport control, hotel reservations, and credit card transactions. If Richard Hampton has been in Italy for the past 3 weeks, there will be extensive documentation of his presence there, Detective Rodriguez explained. That evidence will be difficult to fabricate. The investigation took 5 days, during which both men were held in custody to prevent either from tampering with evidence or fleeing Charleston. The results were conclusive. Passport records confirmed that Richard Hampton had entered Italy on February 12th and had been staying at documented hotels throughout his trip. Handwriting analysis revealed that Robert's recent signatures were sophisticated forgeries, but they contained subtle inconsistencies that proved they were not authentic. Medical examination confirmed that the person claiming to be Richard Hampton had a small scar on his left shoulder from childhood surgery, which matched Dr. Morrison's records for Richard. Most damning, investigators discovered that Robert Hampton had been researching identity theft techniques online for months before their parents' deaths. Robert Hampton conducted an elaborate and premeditated scheme to steal his brother's identity and fortune, Detective Rodriguez announced. The evidence supporting his impersonation is comprehensive, but the evidence proving Richard Hampton's authentic identity is conclusive. Robert was charged with identity theft, fraud, forgery, and theft of assets exceeding $2.8 million. But the damage to Richard's life was extensive and would require months to fully repair. Richard's return to his authentic life in Charleston required systematic rebuilding of relationships, financial accounts, and social standing that had been compromised by Robert's 3-week impersonation. Richard's first priority was securing his financial assets and recovering the money Robert had stolen. Working with Thomas Chen and bank security departments, Richard froze all accounts that Robert had accessed and began the process of reversing unauthorized transactions. Richard recovering stolen funds will take time, Thomas explained, but most of the money can be traced and returned because the transactions were recent and clearly fraudulent. Richard ultimately recovered $2.1 million of the $2.8 million Robert had stolen, though some funds had been transferred to accounts that couldn't be immediately traced. Richard's relationship with Elizabeth Martinez was more complicated to repair. Elizabeth had spent 3 weeks interacting with Robert, who had been charming and attentive while claiming to be Richard. "I feel like I was dating a stranger who looked like you," Elizabeth told Richard. "How do I know which memories are real and which were created by your brother's impersonation?" Richard and Elizabeth attended counseling sessions to work through the psychological impact of the identity deception and rebuild trust in their relationship. Richard's social relationships throughout Charleston required similar reconstruction. Friends and associates had noticed subtle personality changes during Robert's impersonation, but they had attributed these changes to grief over his parents' deaths rather than recognizing an identity switch. "We should have realized something was wrong," Margaret Worthington told Richard. "You seemed different, but we wanted to believe you were coping with loss in your own way." Richard's charitable and social commitments had also been affected. Robert had canceled some obligations and modified others, creating confusion about Richard's reliability and commitment to community activities. Richard spent months rebuilding his reputation and demonstrating that he remained dedicated to the charitable organizations and social causes he had supported for decades. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of Richard's recovery was processing the emotional betrayal of Robert's scheme. "I invited Robert into my home because I believed in family loyalty," Richard told his therapist, Dr. Jennifer Martinez. "He used that trust to study me like a specimen and then steal my entire life." Richard learned that Robert's preparation for the identity theft had been extensive and calculating. Robert had been researching Richard's life through social media, public records, and mutual acquaintances for months before their parents' deaths. "This wasn't an impulsive crime," Detective Rodriguez explained to Richard. "Your brother had been planning this identity theft for nearly a year." Robert's criminal trial attracted significant media attention due to the unusual nature of the crime and the sophisticated methods he had used. Robert was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for identity theft, wire fraud, and theft of assets across state lines. During the trial, Robert showed no remorse for his actions and continued to claim that he deserved equal access to Richard's wealth and social standing. "We're identical twins," Robert told the court during his sentencing hearing. "Why should Richard have everything while I have nothing?" Judge Patricia Williams responded sharply to Robert's justification. "You're identical in appearance, but clearly not in character," Judge Williams said. "Richard Hampton built his wealth and reputation through decades of honest work. You attempted to steal both through elaborate deception." 2 years after Robert's conviction, Richard had recovered from the identity theft and implemented security measures to prevent future fraud. He established verification protocols with friends and financial institutions, requiring multiple authentication methods for important transactions. Richard's relationship with Elizabeth survived the crisis, and they married in 2025. His social standing in Charleston was fully restored, though he approached relationships more carefully. "I learned that identity is built through relationships and character over time," Richard explained. "Robert could copy my appearance, but he couldn't replicate 40 years of authentic connections." Richard established the Hampton Foundation to help other elderly victims of family identity theft and became a consultant for law enforcement agencies investigating similar crimes. Robert remained in federal prison, serving his 15-year sentence. He attempted to contact Richard several times, claiming he wanted to apologize, but Richard declined all communication. "Forgiveness doesn't require me to expose myself to continued manipulation," Richard told his therapist. Today, Richard Hampton lives in Charleston with enhanced security measures, but the same community connections that defined his life before Robert's betrayal. His experience has become a template for preventing sophisticated family identity theft schemes. The Hampton Foundation continues helping elderly Americans protect against family-based financial crimes. Richard's verification networks and authentication protocols have prevented dozens of similar identity theft attempts. The twin brother who spent months studying Richard's life and 3 weeks impersonating him is serving 15 years in federal prison. The $7.3 million he tried to steal has grown to over $9 million through ethical investment and community involvement. Robert's scheme failed because authentic identity cannot be replicated through observation. Richard's relationships, built through decades of consistent character, proved stronger than physical appearance or forged documents. Robert could copy my signature and memorize my history, Richard reflected. But he couldn't replicate the genuine connections I had built through authentic care for other people. Richard's marriage to Elizabeth, his Charleston friendships, and his charitable legacy represent identity based on genuine relationships rather than surface presentation. The security measures Richard implemented provide practical protection, but his real security comes from understanding that authentic identity is earned through character demonstrated over time. Identity isn't genetic, Richard told a recent conference. It's earned through choices, relationships, and consistent values demonstrated over decades. Robert learned that identity theft can succeed temporarily, but cannot sustain permanently against relationships built on authentic character and community connection. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Remember, authentic identity is earned through character, not stolen through deception.